Okay, so you want to launch a space mission, you see the headlines every single week. SpaceX launches another Falcon 9. A new satellite constellation goes into orbit. A space telescope sends back images that blow your mind. The numbers are staggering. Billions of dollars, thousands of engineers, rockets that land themselves. You do the math in your head. If we can put things in space, if we can generate data from orbit, if we can provide global communications and Earth observation, this must be an incredibly profitable business. I want a piece of that. How hard can it be? Here is where most people stop thinking. And here is exactly where this gets interesting. Because the space mission you're picturing, the one where the money just flows like fuel through a rocket engine, is not the space mission that actually exists. Real business is stranger, more complicated, and far more fragile than anything you imagine reading a press release. And the biggest twist? The launch itself, the spectacular moment everyone watches, is almost an afterthought to the people who own the mission. Let us start from the very beginning. Before you spend $1, you need to understand one thing. Not all space mission operators own the same thing. Look at any space mission in the world, and you might be looking at 5 completely different business arrangements. And which one you are standing in determines everything about how much money the operator makes. The first type is the fully independent operator. This is a company or organization that owns the satellite, owns the launch vehicle, owns the ground stations, owns the mission control center, and owns the data rights, everything. They buy launch services from whoever they want and keep every dollar of profit after expenses. Maximum control. Maximum risk. Companies like Planet Labs, which operates hundreds of small Earth observation satellites, or Axiom Space, which is building commercial modules for the International Space Station, operate this way. They own the infrastructure, they own the data, they own the revenue stream. The second type is the partnership operator. Think of international missions like the James Webb Space Telescope, which is jointly operated by NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency or the International Space Station, which involves 15 nations. Partnership operator shares the costs, shares the risks, and shares the benefits. No single entity bears the full financial burden, but no single entity captures all the profit either. The governance is complex, the decision-making is slow, but the risk is distributed. The third type is the government-funded operator. This is when a national space agency like NASA or the European Space Agency funds and operates a mission entirely with taxpayer money. The mission is not designed to generate profit. It is designed to advance scientific knowledge, test new technologies, or achieve national objectives. The economics are completely different because the success metric is not financial return. It is scientific discovery or strategic capability. Fourth type is the commercial operator under contract. A private company like SpaceX or Blue Origin builds and operates a spacecraft or launch service under contract to a government agency or a larger corporation. They are paid a fixed fee or a cost-plus arrangement to deliver a specific capability. They have some operational freedom, but they are locked into contractual requirements and specifications set by the customer. Their profit depends on how efficiently they can deliver what was promised. Fifth type is the venture-backed operator. A startup company raises capital from investors, builds a space mission or service, and attempts to generate revenue that exceeds its cost. Companies like Relativity Space, which is developing 3D printed rockets, or Axiom Space, which is building commercial space stations, operate this way. They are burning investor capital today, betting that they will generate enough revenue tomorrow to justify the investment. Pressure is intense, the timeline is compressed, the stakes are existential. Why does this matter? Because the answer to how much does a space mission cost depends entirely on which of these arrangements you are in. Fully independent operator who owns a profitable satellite constellation is in a fundamentally different financial position than a startup burning through venture capital to develop a new launch vehicle. They are in the same industry but running entirely different businesses. Let us say you decide to build a space mission. You think you're building a satellite and launching it? You are not. You're building a spacecraft with redundant systems, because if something fails in space, you cannot send a technician. You're building power systems because the sun does not always shine on your satellite. You're building thermal management systems because space is both incredibly hot and incredibly cold, depending on whether you're in sunlight or shadow. You're building attitude control systems because your satellite needs to point in the right direction. You're building communication systems because you need to talk to your spacecraft from Earth. You are building propulsion systems because you need to maneuver in orbit and eventually deorbit when the mission ends. You're building radiation shielding because the space environment is hostile to electronics. You are building redundancy into every critical system because failure is not an option. You're also buying launch services. You're buying a rocket that will carry your spacecraft to orbit. You're buying insurance because if your launch fails, you lose everything. You're buying regulatory approval from your National Space Agency. You're buying frequency allocations from the International Telecommunication Union if your satellite uses radio. You're buying orbital slots from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. You're buying tracking and telemetry support from ground stations around the world. You're buying mission operations support, the people and systems that will command your spacecraft every single day for the duration of its mission. Here is what most people underestimate. Spacecraft itself, the hardware that goes into orbit, is often less expensive than everything else combined. A typical Earth observation satellite might cost $50 million to build, but the launch vehicle costs $60 million. Ground infrastructure costs $30 million. The mission operations for 10 years costs $40 million. The insurance costs $10 million. The regulatory and licensing costs cost $5 million. Suddenly, that $50 million satellite is part of a $200 million mission. Building a space mission from scratch is extraordinarily expensive. If you're launching a small satellite on a rideshare mission, your minimum cost is roughly $5 to $20 million. That covers the spacecraft development, the launch service, basic ground infrastructure, and initial operation. If you're launching a medium-sized mission with dedicated launch, you are looking at anywhere from $100 million to $500 million, depending on the complexity and the launch vehicle. If you are building a flagship mission, a space telescope, or a deep space probe, the numbers get serious fast. The James Webb Space Telescope costs $10 billion. The Mars Perseverance rover costs $2.7 billion. The International Space Station cost over $150 billion across all partner nations. After you factor in the spacecraft, the launch vehicle, the ground infrastructure, the mission operations, the insurance, the regulatory compliance, and the contingency reserves, a new space mission typically costs between $100 million and $1 billion to develop and launch. And banks know this. They scrutinize these deals closely, requiring independent feasibility studies and proof that the mission will generate enough revenue to justify the investment. Many first-time operators find that getting financing approved is harder than building the spacecraft itself. Now let us follow the mission before it arrives at the launch pad, because understanding the supply chain tells you a lot about why the costs are so high. It starts with an idea. A company or organization identifies a need. Maybe it is Earth observation data. Maybe it is global communication. Maybe it is scientific research. That idea gets translated into a mission concept. What will the spacecraft do? How long will it operate? What data will it collect? What will it cost? From there, the spacecraft design begins. Engineers work with manufacturers to select components. Solar panels from one supplier, batteries from another, thrusters from a third, computers from a fourth. Each component is tested individually. Then the components are integrated into subsystems. The power subsystem is tested. The propulsion subsystem is tested. Communication subsystem is tested. Then all the subsystems are integrated into the complete spacecraft, and the complete spacecraft is tested again and again and again. This process takes years. A typical spacecraft development timeline is 4 to 7 years from initial concept to launch. During that time, the costs accumulate, engineers are paid, facilities are rented, components are purchased, tests are conducted, mistakes are made and corrected, designs are revised, schedules slip, costs overrun. The spacecraft then goes through environmental testing. It is subjected to vibration that simulates the forces of launch. It is placed in a thermal vacuum chamber that simulates the space environment. It is exposed to radiation that simulates the radiation it will encounter in orbit. It is tested for electromagnetic compatibility to ensure that its systems do not interfere with each other. It is tested for functional performance to ensure that it does what it is supposed to do. After environmental testing, the spacecraft is shipped to the launch facility. This is not a simple truck ride. The spacecraft is packed in a specialized container. It is transported by air or sea depending on the distance and the launch site. It is handled by technicians trained in spacecraft handling. It is protected from vibration, temperature extremes, and contamination. The launch facility, the spacecraft is integrated with the launch vehicle. This is called the integration and test phase. The spacecraft is mated to the rocket. Electrical connections are made. Fluid lines are connected. The spacecraft is tested again to ensure that the integration did not break anything. The launch vehicle is fueled. The countdown begins. How you buy launch services depends on whether you're a government agency, a large corporation, or a startup. A government agency like NASA can negotiate directly with launch providers. They have the budget and the authority to demand specific capabilities and timelines. They can also leverage their purchasing power to negotiate lower prices. A large corporation like a telecommunications company can do the same. They have the resources to negotiate directly with SpaceX or Aerospace or other launch providers. A startup or a small company has fewer options. They can buy a dedicated launch, which is expensive, or they can buy a rideshare slot on a launch that is already scheduled, which is cheaper but less flexible. A rideshare slot might cost $5 to $20 million. A dedicated launch might cost $60 to $150 million depending on the launch vehicle and the destination orbit. Launch vehicle itself is a massive cost. A Falcon 9 rocket costs approximately $62 million per launch. An Atlas V costs around $190 million. An Ariane 5 costs around $220 million. A Long March 5 costs around $150 million. These are the prices that commercial customers pay. Government agencies sometimes negotiate lower prices, but the baseline is clear. Getting to space is expensive. Here is the part that surprises almost everyone. When you launch a space mission, you might assume that the launch vehicle is the biggest cost. It is not. At current prices, the launch vehicle represents roughly 20 to 30% of the total mission cost. The spacecraft development represents another 30 to 40%. Ground infrastructure and mission operations represent another 20 to 30%. Insurance, regulatory compliance, and contingency reserves represent the remaining 10 to 20%. That breakdown varies depending on the mission type. A simple Earth observation satellite might have a lower spacecraft cost and a higher launch cost. A complex scientific mission might have a higher spacecraft cost and a lower launch cost. But the general principle holds: the launch is important, but it is not the whole story. All of that time, the spacecraft is consuming resources: power from solar panels or batteries, propellant for attitude control, bandwidth for communications. The ground infrastructure must support all of that. Mission control must operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the entire mission duration. That is thousands of person-hours of labor. That is millions of dollars in facility costs. That is the real cost of space missions. Let us get very specific about something. A mission control center for a major space program costs $500 million to $2 billion to build. It requires hundreds of people to operate. Each person is a highly trained specialist: a flight director who makes critical decisions about mission operation, capsule communicator who talks to the astronauts or spacecraft, a guidance officer who calculates trajectories, a surgeon who monitors astronaut health, a propulsion officer who manages fuel consumption, a power officer who manages electrical systems, a thermal officer who manages temperature, a communications officer who manages data transmission. Each of these people has years of training and experience. Each of these people earns a six-figure salary. A mission control center for a major program might employ 500 to 1,000 people. That is $100 million to $200 million per year in payroll alone. Over a 10-year mission, that is $1 billion to $2 billion in labor costs. A single spacecraft launch might cost $200 million. Operating that spacecraft for 10 years costs $1 billion to $2 billion. The launch is the visible event. The operations are the invisible cost. This is why space agencies are obsessed with extending mission lifetimes. If you can keep a spacecraft operating for 15 years instead of 10, you spread the operational costs over a longer period. You reduce the cost per year of operation. You get more return on your investment. Winners in space are not the ones who build the cheapest rockets. They are the ones who build the most reliable spacecraft. The ones that operate longer, the ones that require less maintenance, the ones that accomplish more science or provide more service per dollar spent. That is the real competition in space. Now let us run through the numbers on a real functioning space mission. Take a mid-sized scientific mission, a spacecraft designed to study the atmosphere of a distant planet. Total mission cost, $800 million. Spacecraft development and construction, $300 million. That is 37% of the budget. Launch vehicle and launch services, $250 million. That is 31% of the budget. Mission control and ground support, $150 million. That is 19% of the budget. Testing and validation, $80 million. That is 10% of the budget. Insurance and miscellaneous, $20 million. That is 3% of the budget. The mission is designed to operate for 5 years. During those 5 years, the annual operational cost is $30 million. That is $150 million over the 5-year mission. Total mission cost including operations, $950 million. The spacecraft returns scientific data about the atmosphere of a distant planet. That data is published in scientific journals. It is used by researchers around the world. It advances human knowledge, but it generates $0 in direct revenue. The return on investment is knowledge. The return on investment is the advancement of science. The return on investment is the capability to explore space. These are not financial returns, but they are returns nonetheless. Now let us compare that to a commercial satellite mission. A telecommunications company wants to launch a satellite to provide internet service to remote areas. Total mission cost, $200 million. Spacecraft development and construction, $80 million. That is 40% of the budget. Launch vehicle and launch services, $60 million. That is 30% of the budget. Mission control and ground support, $40 million. That is 20% of the budget. Testing and validation, $15 million. That is 7.5% of the budget. Insurance and miscellaneous, $5 million. That is 2.5% of the budget. The satellite is designed to operate for 15 years. During those 15 years, the annual operational cost is $5 million. That is $75 million over the 15-year mission. Total mission cost, including operations, $275 million. Satellite generates $20 million per year in revenue from internet service. That is $300 million over 15 years. Subtract the $275 million in total cost. Net profit, $25 million. That is a 9% return on investment over 15 years. That is less than 1% per year. Compare that to other investments, and it is not attractive. But the satellite company is not in it for the financial return. They are in it for the strategic capability, the ability to provide internet service to remote areas, the ability to compete with terrestrial internet providers, the ability to build a business that did not exist before. That is the real return on investment in space. Here is where we land. A space mission with $1 billion budget might generate only tens of millions in actual profit or scientific return. The gap between cost and return is enormous. Most of the money goes to infrastructure, labor, testing, and compliance. Actual margin for error is razor thin. Success requires obsessive attention to detail, relentless cost management, and the ability to make decisions based on data rather than hope. The operators who truly succeed are not the ones who are best at building rockets. They are the ones who understand that the launch brings the spacecraft to orbit, but the operations make the mission worthwhile, that the location of the launch facility determines the baseline economics, but the reliability of the spacecraft determines how close you get to success. Cost overruns and schedule delays are not failures. They are the costs of doing business in an environment where failure is not an option. The next time you watch a space launch, look past the rocket. Look at the Mission Control Center. Look at the ground tracking station. Look at the spacecraft itself. Look at the years of testing that went into every component. Look at the thousands of people who worked for years to make that launch possible. Because what you're actually watching is not a rocket launch. It is the culmination of billions of dollars, thousands of people, and years of work, all focused on a single moment. And that moment is just the beginning. The real mission starts after the launch. The real cost is in the operation. The real return is in what the spacecraft accomplishes over years or decades in space. Space missions are not about the launch. They are about what happens next. This breakdown of space economics resonated with you. Consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden economics of industries that shape our world. Like this video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which space mission you think represents the best return on investment for humanity.